Volume 2, Chapter 18 of Evelyn, or A Heart Unmasked, a novel by Anna Cora Mowatt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 18. Or one or both must fall. If one, 'tis well. If both, 'twere better. The Duellist. From the Same to the Same. March 27th. I had scarcely folded and commenced sealing my letter yesterday when a scream from Netta, echoed by Blanche, made me drop the burning wax and hasten downstairs. The street door was open. A carriage stood in front of the house. Netta was running towards the coach, from which Mr. Elton and the driver were lifting Richard Willard. They bore him into the house, and I, without inquiring what had befallen him, for now I saw that it was some serious accident, led the way to my own chamber. As they lay Richard upon Ellen's bed, that thoughtful little creature, Netta, caught hold of my dress and inquired, "Shall I run for the doctor? Shall I run quickly for the doctor?" I answered in the affirmative, and she darted away. Richard groaned as they laid him down, but a moment after, in spite of his suffering, he cried out in a gruff tone, "I'm done for. There's no use of crying over spilt milk. I wish it had been through my head. I wouldn't give a fig to live an hour longer. The devil take that scoundrel. Why couldn't he do the thing genteelly while he was about it? He might as well have made a clean job of it at once. I shouldn't have minded if I had only peppered him finely, the scoundrel, the sheep-faced ruffian." I had now gained courage to inquire of Mr. Elton what had happened. Before my question could be answered, it was repeated by Mrs. Willard, who at that moment appeared in the room. "Don't make a fuss, mother," replied Richard, raising himself upon his elbow. "There's something of me left yet, though it ain't much." He sank feebly back upon his pillow. "I suppose we had not trouble enough without your getting into a scrape," remarked Mrs. Willard, in no very conciliatory tone. "Pray tell me what has happened," I once more inquired of Mr. Elton. "How has Mr. Willard been hurt?" "I am very sorry to reply in a duel. I hope that the injury he has sustained is not serious. Had you not better send for medical aid?" "I have already done so. And you—" "He was my second, to be sure, and a braver isn't to be found in these United States. He's no more afraid of bullets and gunpowder than if they were so much salt and green peas. I met him in the street and told him what I was going to do, and when he found trying to persuade me out of it was a no-go, he said he'd stand by me and see fair play, and he did it. I shouldn't want a braver second, nor a more independent fellow, if I was fighting again tomorrow." "And what possessed you to fight at all?" asked Mrs. Willard sharply. "To vindicate the honor of my family, to be sure, and to punish the damnedest scoundrel that walks the earth. We fought at Hoboken. He shot me down at the first fire. I shouldn't have cared a snap for that, but he got off scot-free himself. That's no more bargain for. If I were only on my legs again, I'd riddle him. I would, until there wasn't a sound place in his body." Again I turned to Mr. Elton, and falteringly inquired, "With whom did he fight?" I hardly know why I asked the question, for surely I could have answered it myself. "With Colonel Damereau," replied he. At this moment the quick, laboring breath of somebody behind me attracted my attention. I turned round and beheld Blanche. She had stolen into the room, and was standing at the foot of the bed, grasping the post to support herself. Her large eyes seemed starting from their sockets, and her white and terrified face was turned towards Mr. Elton. His perfect command over every feature was truly astonishing. He neither seemed to recognize nor even to notice her. But when, with a penetrating glance. I looked at him again. He quietly added, "The colonel escaped unhurt. Mr. Willard desired to fire a second time, but found himself unable to stand. The whole affair took place so hurriedly that I think it is probable we shall escape the investigation of the authorities. The penalty of duelling is exceedingly heavy in the state. I assure you that I used my utmost endeavors to prevent the meeting, and even when the parties were on the ground, attempted to effect a reconciliation. But my efforts were thrown away." "Who told you so?" exclaimed Richard boisterously. "Who told you they would be? But you wouldn't believe me. The devil! There's a twinge! Oh, the rascal! The scoundrel! The cowardly, butter-fingered puppy! Why couldn't he finish the thing while he was about it? The deceitful villain! To dare call himself my friend, too! If he'd only have befriended me with a speedy passage to the next world, I could have forgiven him. Oh, fire and blazes! There's a twinge! Go it! Go it! I can't stand this long. The game will soon be up with me." He endeavored to turn upon his side, but failed, and for some minutes lay groaning as though in great agony. When he again spoke, it was to me, and in a much feebler tone. "I shan't stand it too long, Miss Kitty. I shall kick the bucket soon. But it's no matter. I wouldn't give a rush to live now. Miss Kitty, come closer. I didn't mean to call you an old woman, Miss Kitty. Don't remember it. And don't bear me any spite. But come nearer, nearer." I bent over him, and then he whispered, "Is she dead? Poor Evie, poor Evie. Is it all over with her?" "No, she only fainted." For an instant his countenance kindled, but it quickly grew gloomy again, and he muttered, "I'm sorry for it, sorry for it. She couldn't do better than to die. The world's not worth living in now. I wouldn't take a lease of the whole globe for a gift." Netta's return with Dr. R., who fortunately resides in our neighborhood, precluded all further conversation. Dr. R. pronounced that the ball had lodged just below the knee-pan, and it was necessary that the bullet should be extracted. As my services were not required, I left the room before the operation commenced, leading Blanche. Mrs. Willard followed us. The feelings of maternity were not sufficiently strong to attach her to the side of her son in his hour of suffering. We were joined by Mr. Elton as soon as the operation was at an end. It had been a very painful one, and Richard had fainted twice from exhaustion. "Will you permit me to share your labors in attending upon your son?" he said to Mrs. Willard. "We are very much obliged to you," she replied courteously. Mr. Elton glanced at me as though to ask, "Will you also make me welcome?" I replied to his look by a distant bow, and left the room. Last evening Ellen did not return home. Richard occupied her bed, and Mr. Elton also was our guest. I dreamed through the night, extended upon the home-made sofa, which Richard had once pronounced harder than the soft side of a plank, and my stiffened limbs in the morning testified to the truth of his remark. I have not seen the sisters since the day before yesterday. I thought it best not to apprise Ellen, for present, of her brother's unfortunate adventure. The intelligence would only weigh upon her spirits, and, should it accidentally be discovered by Evelyn, we might look forward to the most serious results. Richard is feverish this morning, and though his life is not at present in danger, he has forever lost the use of his limb. Such is Dr. R.'s opinion. I have watched Blanche very closely. She has several times encountered Mr. Elton, but he treats her as a stranger. She is in a continual state of agitation, which prevents her assuming her usual occupation. Her countenance wears the same disturbed look which formerly alarmed me. She does not answer when addressed, and does not seem to notice or comprehend what is said. her mind wanders again. Ah, sweet Blanche, it was a cold heart indeed that could do thee wrong. Night. They are all once more at rest, but my sofa couch is too uninviting to promise repose to my wearied limbs, and the day has been too replete with incidents for the night to bring sleep. This was Saturday, and I spent part of the morning in writing to you. At noon Mr. Elton left Richard, and as his mother spares not her reproaches when alone with him, I carried my work into his room. In a very few minutes Mrs. Willard made an excuse and disappeared. Soon after I thought that a carriage stopped at our door, but presumed I must be mistaken, and that I had only heard the doctor's gig. Some words, which did not reach my ear, were exchanged with Netta in the entry, and slow steps mounted the stairs, and stopped at Richard's apartment. I rose and opened the door. There stood Ellen, supporting what might have been deemed the ghost of her sister. I could not prevent her. She would come. But Richard, Richard, said Ellen anxiously. Richard, faintly exclaimed her sister. Richard had been roused by the voices, and tried to raise himself in the bed. Evie! No, tain't. Yes, 'tis. Effie, Effie! He uttered these words in a smothered voice, but Evelyn heard them. She was almost too feeble to walk, but tried to approach him, and, sustained by Ellen and myself, was led to the bedside. She would have sunk upon her knees, but this I prevented, and placed her in a chair. Ah, what piteous glance was that which she cast upon her brother! And then she said, in a tone full of inexpressible anguish, I have done this. I have brought all this sorrow upon you. No, you haven't neither, answered Richard stoutly, although at the moment he was moved almost to tears. I say it wasn't you. I'd like to hear anybody say it was a sister of mine did it. It was that damned scoundrel, the colonel, the smooth-tongued, oily-faced villain. I suspected him from the first, I did. My poor Evie. Don't now. Don't look as though you're going to be hung. They don't hang women for such things, though the deuce take 'em, they ought to. You cannot know how wretched I am, murmured Evelyn. Don't tell me. I can, though. I never saw a living thing look so down in the mouth, and I'm as badly off myself. Poor Evie, poor Evie. You deserve it, though. So do I, for introducing that scoundrel to you. There's a pair of us. Now, keep a brave upper lip. Don't say any more about it. I'll pepper him yet. Oh, Richard, faltered Evelyn. I will if I ever stand on my legs again. Speak kindly to Evelyn, whispered Ellen. She would come see you. You're a good girl, Nellie, replied Richard. Not many like you. You're the girl for my money after all's said and done. Mother, pray let me see my mother, asked Evelyn beseechingly. Ellen was on the point of seeking Mrs. Willard when she entered the room. I was standing in such a position that Evelyn was accidentally concealed. Mrs. Willard only saw Ellen and accosted her with, So you have deigned to come home at last. You led us to suppose that there was more than one runaway in the family. Evelyn rose up and threw herself at her mother's feet. Mrs. Willard screamed in actual terror. For a moment she contemplated her child with a countenance full of grief and pity. Mother, pardon me. In an instant Mrs. Willard regained her usual uncompromising sternness. Never, she exclaimed bitterly. You have brought poverty and misery and disgrace upon us all. You are no child of mine. She turned away, but Evelyn imploringly clung to her dress. Mother, one word, mother. Mrs. Willard rudely shook her off. Go, take your shame somewhere else. This is no asylum for depraved women. You are nothing to me. If I had seen you in your coffin, I might have grieved over you." "I shall be there soon, mother." "Let go of my dress, will you?" almost screamed Mrs. Willard. "I'll have nothing to do with you." She snatched away the dress which Evelyn was tightly grasping, and hurried out of the room. Ellen assisted me in lifting her sister from the ground. We placed her in a chair, and vainly endeavored to console her. She only shook her head and answered, "I deserve it. I could not hope that all the world would be like you. I have brought it on myself." "Mother's got no more blood in her than a stone, and she isn't as full of feeling as a sucked egg. Don't mind her, Evie. She's too hard on you. She don't take after me in that." Evelyn turned her affectionate eyes upon her brother, and was sinking into a sad reverie, when I aroused her by saying, "We must return, Evelyn. I am going with you. What will Dr. Wesley say when he hears that you have been out?" "Let me stay here. Let me stay with Richard." "That is impossible. Come, Ellen, you have acted very imprudently. We must return." I threw an appearance of haste into my manner which shortened the adieus of the sisters and brother, and before the two former had time to reflect, they were seated in the carriage and on their way to Nancy's dwelling. Upon our arrival we found Amy questioning Nancy, and in great distress at Evelyn's disappearance. I consigned the latter to the care of her friend, and drew Ellen aside to inquire in what manner she had been apprised of her brother's accident. "Billy read an account of the whole affair in the Herald," replied Ellen, "and unceremoniously ran into Evelyn's room to ask if the Mr. Willard was any relation of mine. Evelyn became terribly agitated when she heard what Billy said, and I am afraid that I was not as self-possessed as I should have been. At Evelyn's entreaty, Billy read the account out loud, and then she persisted in going to Richard. I denied her for a long time, but it only made her worse, and I was forced to yield." I left Ellen with her sister and returned home, for I am ill at ease when absent from Blanche. Before Mr. Willard retired this evening, I gave him a brief history of the day's occurrences. He was not until that moment aware of Evelyn's existence. The kind-hearted man was completely overcome, but his feelings towards his erring daughter were all of compassion, not of anger. He desired to see her, and tomorrow, if Evelyn is sufficiently recovered, his request will be granted. The night is advancing, or rather morning is approaching, and I lay by my pen to seek a few hours' slumber. Good night. Happier dreams visit your soft couch than are likely to pay their devoirs to my hard one. They will not find it difficult to give a lasting distaste for homemade sofas. End of chapter 18. Volume 2, Chapter 19 of Evelyn, or A Heart Unmasked, a novel by Anna Cora Mowatt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 19. But, good my lord, I am not used to waiting. Fletcher. From Hubert Damarot to Frederick Ruthven. April 2nd. The plague take all dilatory letter post and all American postmasters. The latter are the most neglectful set of scapegraces who ever cursed a free country by keeping their heads out of a noose. Your letter, dear Fred, if you wrote, and you must have written, in answer to mine, never reached me. I should have heard from you 5 days ago, and here I am yet, in a state of the most unendurable suspense, taking lessons of patience. I make my daily calls at the post office as regularly as a monk says his Aves, and walk away again with the visage of a Monsieur Mallet. I was half resolved to look upon you as an hors de combat, done for and defunct, and entertain some thoughts of buying sables, when J.D.Z. informed me that he saw you 3 days ago at Washington. Come, Fred, stand by an old friend when you see him plunged up to the shoulders in the slough of despond, and write me by return of mail. I find that in one respect I have no affinity to the chameleon. Or is it a fabulous conceit that praiseworthy reptile lives upon air? Unless you make haste with that paltry loan mentioned in my last, I shall be obliged to solve all doubts upon this question by trying the experiment myself. Why, man, do you suppose that there is any doubt of your reimbursement? Tomorrow was to have been my wedding day. The deuce take the sex! But I will win Amy yet, though I can't promise to do it in 24 hours. My courtship will be a work of time, and I require funds to make proper investments in bouquets, bijouterie, etc., to lay a foundation for securing the capital. True, I have met with 1 or 2 rebuffs from the fair icicle, but nil desperadum is my motto, and success invariably crowns the dauntless. Common men are discouraged by obstacles, but put a barrier in the way of a man of energetic will, and you will only double his power. Aeolus has unkennelled all his ill winds and loosed them upon me for the past 2 weeks. I have withstood a perfect tempest and hurricane of disasters. Not a zephyr that blew any good. Twice have I fallen into the hands of the Philistines, but more of that when we meet. Then my orangutan Dick has grown vicious and shown his teeth. A few days ago I administered a quietus for his snarling in the shape of a bullet through his knee. I had not the conscience to aim higher, for fear of doing the poor fool an injury. I was well aware that the fellow hardly knew the stock of a pistol from the bridge, or I should have followed Randolph's example, and appeared upon the ground in an ample robe de chambre, and given Dick an opportunity of showing his skill in searching out the substantials. Until the affair is hushed up, you may suppose that it would be in my interest to take leave New York, lest the authorities should be on our track. But until I hear from you, how am I to get away? There are some little impediments on the road which obstruct a free exit. I doubt my own talents for enacting the chevalier d'industrie, and at present that appears the only highway open for gaining the daily bread of which I stand in need. Jesting apart, dear Fred, I still hope to see you act like a man, one whose soul does not lie within the compass of his purse strings, and if it did, they should unclose to share the very principle of life itself with a needy friend. The wheel is bearing me round again. We must shake hands at the bottom, or when I reach the top to which I am hastening, But threats are idle and ungentlemanly. Your answer to my letter has miscarried. Therefore, write me again, and speedily, to your distressed friend, Hubert Damoreau. End of chapter 19. Volume 2, Chapter 20 of Evelyn, or A Heart Unmasked, a novel by Anna Cora Mowatt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 20. True revenge is patient as the watchful alchemist, sagacious as the bloodhound on the scent, secret as death. Epps Sargent. From Catherine Bolton to Elizabeth Montague. April 2nd. Sad were the tidings communicated to me this morning through Miss Ashburton, whose little daughters are my most promising pupils. Mr. Merritt is preparing to sue for divorce, and worse, Laura Hilson is pronounced by the gossiping world his bride-elect. Ah, Evelyn's chastening has indeed been severe. Blow after blow falls upon her doomed head, but she no longer resists. Her misery is too full of despair for her even to murmur. She asks but one thing more of this world, a grave. Her hopes are placed upon the next. And Laura Hilson, how thoroughly successful have been the evil machinations of this designing girl! We have every one in turn been instruments in her hands, and she has played what stops she pleased upon us all. I questioned Dr. Wesley a few days ago, and learnt that he had seen Miss Hilson lately, that he had, inadvertently, mentioned Ellen's devotion and mine to the unknown invalid, and that Laura, after many anxious inquiries, pronounced that the doctor's patient was no other than Evelyn Merritt. By whom the anonymous letters were written is no longer a matter of doubt. Evelyn's interview with her father must have been deeply affecting, but I was not present at their first meeting. Mr. Willard now sees his daughter regularly every day, but his wife remains inexorable. Richard is convalescent, but unable to move his wounded limb. His impatience greatly retards his recovery, but Dr. R. does not consider him in a dangerous state. Mr. Elton continues to pay his daily visits to the house. I am busied with my school, and we constantly pass each other in the entry, or meet at the door, and exchange a few commonplace remarks. We have never once entered into conversation. Outwardly, we are little more than strangers to each other. Ellen tells me that Dan has been engaged as a porter for a large mercantile establishment, and receives high wages. The poor man has partially recovered his sight, but still suffers. I also unexpectedly learnt that this situation was procured for him by Mr. Elton. Well may he be active in doing good. How else can he expiate the evil? Netta daily becomes more serviceable, and Blanche has grown entirely useless. Her faculties are totally paralyzed. Tender and sincere is the compassion she excites. A single glance at her dejected countenance almost unfits me for the discharge of my duties. I am pursued by that troubled look, those mournful dark eyes, now gazing on vacancy, and now flashing with the wildness of insanity, are ever before me. Perhaps I have neglected her. If so, she must command more of my time. My thoughts she cannot more engross. April 3rd. Today Amy was to have become a wife. I called for her on my way to Nancy's this afternoon, for she had promised to accompany me. She must have passed a sleepless night and a sorrowful day, for her eyes were heavy, and the smile with which she greeted me looked as though it should have been followed by a tear. Her health is so delicate that this bracing air withers rather than invigorates. Carefully and tenderly over her gentle bosom I had pinned her fur tippet. We were almost ready to sally forth when a small package was placed in Amy's hands. Curiosity was instantly on the alert. We opened it together. It contained a magnificent bridal veil, a wedding gift from one of Amy's uncles residing in Maine. Although he had not lately heard from his niece, the idea that her nuptials might not take place had never entered into the head of the simple-hearted old man. Amy glanced at the veil, which I was unfolding thoughtfully, descanting as I did so upon the richness of the embroidery. With a trembling hand She took it from mine, laid it on the table, and, turning away, said, "Let us go to Evelyn. She expects us." In spite of her wonderful self-control, Amy could not speak calmly. She appeared to be suffocating. In passing out of the room, we encountered Mrs. Elwell. Amy pointed to the veil and said more composedly, "From uncle. Lay it aside, mother dear." Mrs. Elwell pressed her child to her swelling bosom and burst into tears. A few words, a very few words, Amy whispered in her mother's ear, and then, taking my arm, for she needed support, we left the house together. Talk of heroism in the soldier who braves death amidst the exciting combat of the battlefield. Far more heroic is a woman's calm endurance of a weary life. April 4th. The first words that greeted me on reaching home yesterday were spoken by Mrs. Willard, whose tones daily grew shriller. "Your pretty favourite Blanche has disappeared. Netta wanted to search for her, but that I forbid. There is too much work to be done for the servants to be gadding about in the streets all day. Yours is a finely regulated household, to be sure." "How long has she been gone?" I inquired abruptly. "I'm sure I don't know, a couple of hours or more." Without speaking another word, I hastened from the house in pursuit of Blanche, and, taking chance as my guide, it was already dusk, and fortunately I met Mr. Willard returning from his counting-room. He kindly and willingly offered to aid me in my search. We walked straight on, almost too much alarmed to converse, but every once and a while indulging in some unconnected and unmeaning observation, as though to persuade ourselves that we felt perfectly calm. Scarcely had we reached Prince Street before I observed a crowd, or rather a mob, gathering a short distance in advance of us. In another moment a young girl rushed by and disappeared. She wore neither hood nor shawl. The dark hair, partially loosened, and streaming in the wind, entirely concealed her face. One arm was extended as she ran, and she grasped something in her hand which, in the rapidity of her flight, I could not distinguish. "Was that not Blanche?" asked Mr. Willard, turning to look after her. "No, yes, perhaps it was," I replied, but very doubtingly. "Had we not better return, then?" A feeling stronger than mere curiosity made me answer, "Let us first see what is the matter here. It might not have been Blanche. At all events, let us discover why this crowd has gathered." While I spoke, the throng parted. Several men were bearing between them a person, either seriously wounded or otherwise injured. We took refuge upon the steps of a druggist's shop. As the men drew nearer, followed by the mob, we caught the sound of the most fearful imprecations, mingled with groans, and ever and anon a savage yell, apparently wrung forth by the most intense agony. These curses, groans, and yells proceeded from the injured man. My limbs shook so violently that I caught hold of Mr. Willard for support. I dreaded to look. The sound of the voice was so familiar. Nearer and nearer came the men. Willard, now greatly excited, pressed forward, unconsciously drawing me with him. Oh, what a horrible spectacle met our startled eyes! In the arms of the three men lay a miserable wretch, whom we had known too well, for we recognized him in spite of his frightful transformation. I can hardly describe to you his appearance. The glance which I took was so hasty, and I had not courage to look again. His face was blistered, scorched, and mangled, as though some unquenchable flame had eaten to the very bone. One eye was entirely closed, and appeared to me as though it had been burnt from its socket. His magnificent forehead was indented by deep scarlet ridges. The glossy black hair that once clustered so gracefully about it had been torn away by his own frantic hands. His lips— but I spare you the details so terrible. It was Colonel Damereau, but Colonel Damereau forever robbed of the weapons of the demigod Alcides. Mr. Willard shrank away, muttering, "An ugly business, an ugly business that." Many of the throng, who could press near enough to behold the face of the miserable man, drew back in horror, and he was soon borne into the apothecary's shop. Home, home was all I could say, and homeward we hurried. Netta opened the door for us. "Blanche," I ejaculated. "Oh, come to her quickly," answered the frightened child, preceding me as I ran up the stairs. In her chamber, crouching in the farthest corner, and moaning and muttering unintelligible words, sat Blanche. I approached and accosted her gently. She stretched out her right hand towards me. It held a bottle labelled with the word vitriol. She seemed unconscious of any pain, yet that hand was blistered and burnt, and her clothes were scorched in many places by the consuming liquid. "Oh, Blanche, what have you done?" "Both vows. I have kept both vows. Father, thou art avenged. Where is he? Oh, if you had seen him, his eyes! They will never shine lovingly again. Their basilic light is quenched. His lips, they cannot betray now. Look, it is emptied." She dropped the bottle as she spoke. I was speechless, powerless with awe. For the first time Blanche now seemed to experience acute suffering from her hand. Uttering a sharp cry, she held it towards me with the significant action of a child seeking relief. The flesh was seriously burnt, and part of the hand looked swollen, and part seemed strangely shriveled. The simple remedies which I have found efficacious in cases of ordinary burns were applied, but gave no relief. She grew wild with pain, wilder, I should have said, for she was frantic before. Dr. R. examined the hand, and after some hours of agony his prescriptions ameliorated her sufferings. It was then that her madness, for reason was now wholly dethroned, took a different shape. She wrung her hands and wept, and tossed about her arms, muttering, "Send it away, shut it out. Do not let it stare at me so, will you? What a frightened face! Who did it? Not I. I tell you I loved him. I would lay down my life for him. Who did it? Do not let it scowl at me so. It has no eyes. Flames of fire dart out from the hollow sockets. Take it away, take it away. They burn me." I tried to dissipate this afflicting vision by soothing words, and she turned towards me with a vacant gaze and said, "Bring my father, will you? Tell him that Hubert is here, and that we are to be married today. Tell him that I am innocent, that it was all a foolish dream, that we are to be married. Go bring him. I will never leave him again, and we shall be so happy. Do not cross the graveyard as you go. My mother lies there. I did not kill her. Let her rest." Raving thus frantically, the wretched creature passed the night. Morning finds her too exhausted to speak, and yet no more composed. It was Colonel Damereau, then, who caused the misery of this misguided girl, and Mr. Elton. They were in Charleston at the same time. She might have seen them together, and recognized Ernest as his friend. How blind I have been! Who is not blind that trusts to appearances? Dreadful yesterday! When shall I forget its horrors? That yesterday was to have been the bridal of Colonel Damereau. End of chapter 20. Volume 2, Chapter 21 of Evelyn, or A Heart Unmasked, a novel by Anna Cora Mowatt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 21. 'Tis long, my lord, since we have met alone, and with what different feelings do we meet to those we knew in happier hours long past. James. From the same to the same. April 6th. To become conscious of a fault, to acknowledge, or to expiate it, they should all be one, should they not? Or following one another in such united succession that, to the mind, they seem but one continuous act. Why then should womanly shame cry out against the avowal which generosity and affection are mentally framing into words? A certain philosopher would explain this paradox by repeating that women are made up of contradictions. Deny it as we may, he was a wise man who came to this conclusion. "How is Blanche?" kindly inquired Mr. Elton, as I joined him in the parlour last evening. "No better. She alternately sinks into a state of stupor and is roused into one of frenzy." Mr. Elton heard my reply, acknowledged it with a sigh and a look of condolence, and then took up a newspaper that was lying upon the table. As for me, I am sure I do not exactly know what I did, but I believe that after fidgeting about the room for a minute or two, I sat down to my work. The thread knotted and twirled at every stitch. The needle grew rusty, and the strawberry emery cushion which I held between my finger and thumb had lost its cleansing power. Mr. Elton. He looked up from his paper, and I punctured the strawberry with amazing rapidity, thinking to myself all the time, why are men so stupid? Mr. Elton, I wondered what could have made my throat so husky. He still looked inquiringly at me, and I finished my sentence by saying, "Will you ring for a glass of water?" Netta answered the summons. The water was brought and drunk. I had laid by my work, and Mr. Elton had dropped his fascinating newspaper, that dangerous rival of women. When I saw it fall, I felt as though some powerful adversary had been thrust out of the way. "Mr. Elton," I commenced a third time, "will you pardon me, but—" My inexplicable confusion surprised Mr. Elton. It was probably the unwonted courtesy of my manner which induced him to reply, "It is I only who should sue for pardon. For what can you desire forgiveness? For it is difficult to confess one's own blindness and injustice, for having harbored an injurious thought, for having mistaken you for Colonel Damereau, and for having regarded you as the cause of Blanche's misery." Oh, what an exquisite sensation of relief filled my mind when I had forced out these words. "Can it be possible? Your coldness, then, your strange reserve, and which I thought sprang from indifference, may I attribute them to another origin, and—" But why repeat his words, when neither tone nor look can be described? Nor give you my answer. You are not so dull as to be unable to divine it. Heaven has permitted the dream of youth to be realized when youth has fled, and I may say with the poet that happiness awhile foregone is riches well laid out, a usury double, then coming back. It is not the blooming girl and the enthusiastic youth who hand in hand are commencing life's journey together. But those hands will not be less fondly knit, nor will their feet less firmly tread the short remainder of the route, because sorrow has chastened and experience strengthened their hearts. I am anticipating. It is not all promised fruit that ripens, not until Evelyn is restored, not until Blanche no longer needs my care, and Ellen is re-established in her school, not until then may I dwell upon the fulfillment of my own happiness. Evelyn has conceived a strong desire to behold her husband again. To convince her of the impracticability of such an interview is an ungracious task. When I think how considerate, how kind has been every act of his life towards me, she this morning remarked, when I remember my own ingratitude, my disregard of his happiness, the unpardonable injuries I have done him, I feel as though it would be at least some relief to confess my own degradation. It would be some consolation to listen to his reproaches. We have concealed from her the terrible retribution with which Colonel Damereau has been visited, but I thought it expedient to communicate that Mr. Merritt was instituting proceedings preparatory to suing for a divorce, and that Laura Hilson was reported to be his affianced bride. Evelyn's cheek paled and crimsoned again as she replied, "He does well. I would have besought him myself to obtain his freedom, and never more to remember me or the misery I have commissioned him. But Laura Hilson, if he had chosen any other bride, one worthy of him, I should have died content. Oh, Miss Catherine, when I had the right, I neither warmly loved nor truly appreciated Walter, and now that I should not dare think of him, now he has grown inexpressibly dear to me." A strange contradiction this, and yet I believe that Evelyn is not singular in her feelings, and that she fully exemplifies the incomprehensible nature of the sex. I made some slight attempt to dissuade her from seeking an interview with her husband, but she silenced me by saying, "I must, indeed I must. I could not rest, I could not die in peace until I had seen him." A short time afterwards, she placed a letter in my hand, bidding me to read it and then dispatch it to Mr. Merritt. Under existing circumstances, could it be considered a breach of confidence if I enclosed you a copy? From Evelyn to Mr. Merritt. By what name shall I call you, now that my own crimes have deprived you of the title which I was unable to appreciate? I have violated every tie, but terrible has been the voice of retributive justice. I never deserved to be your wife, and what am I now? Walter, grant me one request. I ask it in the name of that parted angel, who awaits you in the land of joy, who will bless you, and may never be permitted to cast even a pitying glance upon me. Grant me one more interview. Let me carry the remembrance of your last words, even though they be reproaches, to the couch of death. God, in his mercy, will not greatly prolong my wretched existence. Let me behold you once again, and then may you ever forget one so hopeless and lost as Evelyn. End of chapter 21. Volume 2, Chapter 22 of Evelyn, or A Heart Unmasked, a novel by Anna Cora Mowatt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 22. Within my bosom there are thoughts of happier days than these, and softness steals upon the steps of recollected love, and turns revenge to weakness. Blanche of Navarre. From the same to the same, April 7th. Evelyn wept for hours over the letter which I this morning laid before her. The letter was from her husband, and every word in these well-known characters inflicted a double pang. She sat with her eyes fixed upon the open letter, which lay upon her lap, and her tears raining fast and thick upon it, though their lids never closed. Ellen and I made no attempt to disturb this salutary outburst of penitent grief. Only once Evelyn turned to us, and then she said, in an almost inarticulate voice, "I would not dare press my lips to it. I have lost the right. It would seem like polluting with my touch the hand that wrote." The letter was as follows. From Mr. Merritt to Evelyn. April 7th. God forgive you, Evelyn. The hopes and joys of my whole existence were centered in you, and you have annihilated them. I lived upon the breath of the world's good repute, and you have covered me with shame. God forgive you. I am too utterly miserable to think of reproaches. Of what avail would be the interview which you desire? Could it blanch your sullied fame, or reanimate my crushed spirit? Yet come. I have ever been weak when you were concerned, and I blush at the avowal. In spite of your dishonor, I would behold you once more, Evelyn. But we may not meet openly, for the world must not know of my weakness. Come to me at 5 this afternoon at my counting-house. You will find me in the inner chamber. The clerk shall be absent, and the street at that hour is generally deserted. Evelyn, Evelyn, what a return you have made for my illimitable love! Though you held not your own honor dear, oh, was not some sacrifice due him whose soul harbored no thought save to promote your happiness? I spare you my reproaches. If your wretchedness bears any resemblance to mine, you need them not. Come to me at the appointed hour, despoiled of the priceless crown of purity, fallen and disgraced. Still let me see you. Walter Merritt. April the 8th. The carriage that was to bear Evelyn to her husband stood at the door. The clock had struck the appointed hour. Still Evelyn lingered. Her strength had departed. She lacked courage to meet him whom she had irredeemably wronged. "The hour has passed, Evelyn," I whispered in her ear. She looked at me with a terrified glance, and then was seized with a sudden fit of shivering. "Oh, I cannot, I dare not." "But Walter awaits you," I answered reproachfully. "Does he?" she asked, as though uncertain that I had spoken correctly. No, he waits no longer. Oh, what a frightful vision! I saw it as before. It has frozen my blood. But it is not. Could it be real? Nay, Evelyn, arouse yourself. You are made the sport of your own disordered and excited imagination. Remember that the hours are long to those who expect, and Walter is now listening to every distant step, and hoping that it may be yours. So he is, but I am very feeble. At this moment I could not bear to hear his reproaches. They would kill me. Have you not you yourself sought this interview? Trust me, Evelyn, he will not reproach you. Will he pardon? She asked abruptly, in an almost hopeful tone. I could not venture to answer that question, and said merely, "It is very late. Are you not ready?" "Yes, but come with me." I complied with her request, and after assisting her into the carriage, for she was very weak, I took my seat beside her. During our ride I tried to reassure and inspire her with courage, nor did I fail to remind her of how anxiously she desired to behold her husband. The carriage stopped. Evelyn had become perfectly calm. She drew her veil over her thin and pallid face, saying, "It would shock him if he saw at once how much I was changed," and then, with a firm step, descended from the carriage. I feared for her, though I was now far more agitated than she, and encircling her waist with my arm, we entered Mr. Merritt's counting-room together. Every desk was empty, not even a porter was stationed in the deserted apartment. We passed rapidly through the room, but at the door of the inner chamber Evelyn stopped, and caught hold of my hand, just as I placed it upon the lock. Well might thronging memories cause her to pause, for that door had but too often flown open to welcome her. In another moment she herself turned the handle, and we found ourselves in an apartment which Mr. Merritt in happier days had furnished with the most extravagant elegance. We at first thought that the room was vacant, for there was no signs of life and motion. The fire in the grate had died out, and the deepening twilight shed but a sombre and uncertain light over the dim objects around us. We stood motionless, listening for Mr. Merritt's voice, and straining our eyes to pierce the gloom. Nothing was audible but the quick gasping of Evelyn's breath, nothing visible but the luxurious and empty chairs near us. I was about to speak, when the rising moon, with her pure cold light, faintly illumined the chamber. Upon a sofa, in a remote part of the room, lay the figure of a man, wrapped in a large cloak. His back was turned towards us, but Evelyn instantly recognized the form of her husband, and the same thought crossed her mind that entered mine. Tired with watching and expectation, he had fallen into a heavy slumber. Evelyn withdrew her arm, and with a faltering step advanced towards him. "Walter!" she exclaimed, but he woke not. "Walter!" she added in a louder, but even more thrilling voice. "I am here, not to implore your pardon, that could not be, but to behold you once more, to claim at least your pity when you see the fearful changes that suffering and sin have wrought." Still no answer. Evelyn drew nearer and lightly placed her hand upon the arm of her husband, but drew it back with a terrific, heart-harrowing shriek. She had touched a corpse. Regardless of her safety, I rushed from the chamber. To whom or how I gave the alarm I know not, but when I re-entered the room several men, one of them bearing a light, followed me. To the latest day of my life I shall never forget the scene which then presented itself to my eyes. Evelyn was lying stretched half across the body of her husband. Her beautiful head rested upon his bosom, and one arm was tightly wound about his neck. We raised her up. Happily for her, she had fallen into a state of insensibility. In lifting her from her recumbent position, the cloak was drawn from Mr. Merritt's shoulders. One hand hung lifeless over the side of the sofa, the other grasped a pistol, which was pressed upon his heart. He had died by his own hand. I would have hurried Evelyn away, but she revived, and springing from my arms again, she threw herself upon the corpse. Even in death there was a sorrowful expression upon that ghastly, upturned face, and the sharp cheekbones and sunken cheeks, the whitening hairs, the fallen jaw and livid lips, were to me full of terror. Oh, what they must have been to Evelyn! She clung to the lifeless body, abstractedly pushing the hair from the icy forehead, with her finger closing the lids of the glazed eyes, and placing her cheek to the open mouth, that she might feel, perhaps, lingering breath. The only words she uttered were, "This too. There was only this wanting. It is my work. O God, visit his sin upon me." The room was now filling with strangers, and the coroner had been summoned. I endeavored to draw Evelyn away, but one arm was still twined about her husband, and my words fell upon an unconscious ear. A gentleman, whose face was familiar, stood near me. He saw my distress, and, without hesitation, lifted Evelyn in his powerful arms and bore her to the carriage. For an instant she struggled, and then her limbs relaxed. She had again become insensible. As I was following her from the room, I beheld upon the table where the light was placed a folded letter. It was addressed to Evelyn. The handwriting was that of her husband. I took it up and carried it away. Have you never seemed to yourself as though you were moving about in a dream? It was thus that I felt through that long evening and weary night, as I mechanically aided Ellen and Amy in administering to the bereaved and wretched Evelyn. Consciousness was speedily restored, but her whole appearance and demeanour had changed. The wildest burst of grief were better than this mute, agonizing despair. To arouse her from her stupor, I showed her Mr. Merritt's letter. The last words his hand had traced were as follows: From Mr. Merritt to Evelyn. The struggle is too great. I can no longer endure it, and heaven pardon me, I seek a criminal release. To behold you, Evelyn, would be to forgive. I know my own infirmity. I love you, in spite of your shame. I would open my arms to receive you, though your name were 10 times as blackened. But this cannot be. How can I meet the eyes of the world with a dishonored wife pressed to my heart? I must fly from myself and from you, for your image gives me no peace. Evelyn, too madly loved, too hopelessly ruined, your name will be the last upon my lips, thine and that of our child. Farewell. Yours in death, as through life, Walter. The effect of this letter upon Evelyn was not so marked as I had supposed it would be. She read and reread and retained it in her hand, but never wept. The shock had been too great for tears. End of chapter 22. Volume 2, Chapter 23 of Evelyn, or A Heart Unmasked, a novel by Anna Cora Mowatt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 23. The world is empty. The heart will die. There's nothing to wish for beneath the sky. Thou, Holy One, call thy child away. I've lived and loved, and that was today. Make ready my grave clothes tomorrow. The Piccolomini, Schiller. From the Same to the Same, April 9th. I marvel at myself that at this moment I can write to you, but long habit has taught me to seek refuge from my thought in my pen, and perhaps there is selfishness in this as in too many of our acts, for the sympathy I seek steals away the poignancy of grief. I was laving the hand of Blanche this morning with a soothing ointment, and endeavouring to make her recognize my voice and face, when Ellen joined me. She was unusually agitated, and could hardly articulate the words. "Come to Evelyn. She has expressed a wish to see you." I instantly complied with her request, consigning Blanche to the care of Netta. "Oh, it was cruel, too cruel. Mother has no heart," exclaimed Ellen, when we issued into the street. "I have entreated her upon my knees, yet she will not come to Evelyn, and Evelyn implored me to bring her. It was too cruel, too heartless, too— But it is of your mother you speak." Ellen sighed without attempting to finish her sentence, but the sigh seemed to say, "I would it were not." Evelyn had not left her bed since the hour when she had been torn from the corpse of her husband. The last fearful blow had struck home. We found Amy by her side, and, like the guardian angels that hovered about her unseen, infusing peace into her stricken soul, so Amy whispered words of comfort in her ear. "Mother," faintly murmured Evelyn, as she turned her eyes inquiringly towards us. Ellen shook her head sadly, for her tongue refused to say she would not come. A sigh, a gentle, not reproachful sigh, escaped from Evelyn's lips, and she stretched out her hand to me. I approached her. Her tone was so low, and the quickness of her breath rendered her words so broken that I could hardly distinguish her words. "Miss Catherine, God, you taught me. I have no fear. When we meet. Her utterance was impeded, but a smile full of hope illumined her countenance, and she tenderly, though feebly, returned the kiss which I imprinted upon her pale lips. I drew back to give place to Ellen, who was tremblingly pressing towards her sister. Again Evelyn made an effort to speak, and she gasped out, "Bless you. He will bless you. Tell my father. I am going. Walter. Lilla." We could not conceal from ourselves that her last moment was approaching. The cold dew of death was already upon her brow. His touch had already sealed her lips and dimmed her eyes. Amy bent anxiously forward to claim one last word, one look of recognition, from the beloved one she had watched with such tireless tenderness. But it was too late. Evelyn's utterance was gone. This world was fading from her sight. There was something awful in this gradual separation of the spirit from its mortal garment, too awful for tears or loud lamentations. In perfect silence we stood around the couch of death, watching the slightest changes wrought by the destroyer's hand. The lids drooped over those beautiful eyes, yet closed not entirely, for through the silken lashes the deeply blue orbs were still visible. Evelyn's breath, which for some moments came hurriedly and laboriously forth, grew slower, at short intervals appeared to cease, and then was gently drawn again. Suddenly a light irradiated the inanimate countenance, robing it in an unearthly beauty. A heavenly smile parted the lips. The eyes shone brightly, as with an upward look they opened. A slight shivering ran through the stiffening frame, a gasp, a faint sigh. The jaw fell, the eyes glazed. The spirit was freed. Had it not caught a glimpse of heaven in that parting moment? Was it not that transient look which left an angelic smile imprinted even upon the soulless, valueless clay? And Evelyn is no longer of this world. And many, who in the days of her pride courted and caressed, and it may be some who truly loved her, will never mention her name without a blush or a sneer. Yet amongst the angels of a juster land her errors are pardoned, and she lives for immortal and eternally increasing joy. End of chapter 23. Volume 2, Chapter 24 of Evelyn, or A Heart Unmasked, a novel by Anna Cora Mowatt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 24. There is a love which forms in early days, lives on through silent years. From Catherine Elton to Elizabeth Montague. New York, April 20th, 18 blank. To hear from me but once in a whole year, and that once through the expressive medium of 2 highly glazed bits of pasteboard with a name embedded in flourishes on each, and a shabby little package tied with telltale white ribbon. Truly, my gentle friend, your complaints are not causeless. I have been so long wedded to my pen that the union could only be interrupted and the goose quill discarded and divorced to give place to another lord. The 1,000 little gossiping narrations and sage reflections and grave confessions which my communicative disposition induced me to impart to you are now breathed in another, not less attentive ear. She who gives not her perfect confidence with her hand is not spiritually wedded. Believe me that I will willingly gratify your curiosity in affording you some further information respecting the friends whose histories you have followed through 2 eventful years. It is like La Fontaine's transformed tabby returning to her former cat-like vulgarities. Of Ellen first, Ellen who ranks first in our hearts, and whose life of love ensures her an exalted rank in eternity. She is still dwelling in her city cottage, her school rapidly increases, and her thoughts are engrossed by every active employment has use and God for its end. And this is the Ellen who 3 years ago found no beauty in this affluent world, no sweetness in life, no hope in the future, no consolation in the past. It is the pure motive of her acts which lends them their loveliness. Did she look for gratitude or praise as the meed of kindness performed, then would she be but a capital calculator at the best. Her charity is for charity's sake, her goodness is for the sake of good, and therefore do her deeds send up a grateful incense to heaven. Yet is she faultless, this same exemplary fair one? By no means. She has never forgotten her mother's cruelty to Evelyn. A marked coldness exists between Mrs. Willard and her sole remaining daughter, and Ellen is always constrained and uneasy in her mother's presence. Were Ellen's nature wholly pure, she could pity and pardon the unjust, and tolerate even the heartless. The bright October morning, when I took leave of the little cottage in 27th Street to enter my own more ostentatious dwelling, would have been a sad one for Ellen, had she not forgotten all selfish regret in sympathizing with my joy. And happily our residences are situated so near each other that my windows overlook her garden, and we have established a set of telegraphic signs that form a pleasant chain of communication. I not unfrequently pay visit to Ellen's schoolroom, and my quondam little favourite, Annie, ever loudly testifies her delight on beholding her early instructress. It is a true pleasure to steal upon Ellen unawares. The atmosphere about her breathes of such perfect peace and order. She is so thoroughly contented with her lot. Her school is so judiciously regulated, her house so neat, her garden, like her soul, so full of daily springing beauty. That tiny, tenderly tended garden reminds me of the old flower woman. I must say a word of her, en passant. Of a fine afternoon in spring or summer, you could not stroll down Broadway without noticing her and her floral offerings. But the old woman no longer crouches beneath a tattered umbrella. The proceeds of Ellen's bouquets have procured her a comfortable-looking sort of wooden cupboard, and there the smiling old dame sits ensconced amongst her flowers. It does the heart good to look upon her, for one might well fancy that she was rejuvenated by the fresh blossoms sending forth their perfume around her withered form. Her nosegays, too, are worth more than a passing glance, for they are daily supplied from Ellen's garden, and are not unfrequently from the greenhouses of some of her pupils, for many of those, following in the footsteps of their beloved instructress, find their chief delight in delighting others. Of Mrs. Willard, what shall I say, except that she is Mrs. Willard still? She has lately been seized by an all-engrossing horror of growing old, and in truth her uneasy fretfulness and constant spleen have greatly contributed to wither and wrinkle her hitherto smooth skin. Every softening soap, cosmetic wash, and eau de beauté advertised in the papers is sure to find its mysterious way to her toilette table. She passes her days in dyeing her hair, darkening her brows and lashes, setting forth her remaining charms, and in bewailing and concealing the departed ones. And all pain and toil is endured for the sake of repairing the worn-out clay-sprung garment, which can last her but a few years at the best, while the beauties of the spirit, which must serve her to eternity, are despised and neglected. I would as soon think of patching up a threadbare dress, while the new one of untarnished splendor awaited my finishing touches. Formerly she attired herself in excellent taste, but as she grows older she dresses younger, affecting the coquettish airs and the uninformed manners of youth, and she really persuades herself that this shallow cheat is undiscovered by the politely blinded world. Every day, as soon as her toilette is completed, she sallies forth and takes her station in my parlour, for the purpose of entertaining my guests, or rather of astonishing them by her wonderful volubility and self-derived importance. I look upon her as one of those necessary encumbrances to which good nature must uncomplainingly give house-room, the foil of earnestness and sincerity, a shadow in the bright picture of life. Death, to her, is a sound so terrible that she almost faints at the mere mention of the word, and yet she, too, must die. Poor Richard, Dick, as he still calls himself, he is limping on crutches through the world, ludicrously comparing himself to the diable boiteau, and ever talking of independent fellows, of his country, his family, and his own astonishing intellectual powers. But Richard is not himself, and I fear me never will be again. He cannot speak of his favourite Evie without brushing his rough coat sleeves across his eyes, and the action is always followed by an oath, and an observation that he will pepper that rascally colonel yet if he catches him in these diggings again. Ever since that unfortunate duel, Richard has resided with his parents and sister. Mr. Elton has procured him a situation as clerk in the same mercantile establishment of which Mr. Willard is a bookkeeper. But Dick still persists in calling himself a lawyer, adding that he is reposing on his laurels, and takes up the present situation to look after the establishment for the sake of obliging a friend. But he talks not as boisterously as was his wont, and I should not wonder to see him grow melancholy and gentlemanly as Jacques himself. Mr. Willard deserves the truly American title of man well to do in the world. To Ellen, who first pointed out the veins of gold that ran unnoticed beneath his feet, the verdant spots in what was to him a desert, and who first taught him the value and beauty of existence, his devotion is unbounded. his prosperity yearly increases, and yet hardly keeps pace with his growing gratitude and content. Good man! He often comes in our way through his over-anxiety to be busy and obliging, but even haste could not thrust him aside without a smile and a word of thanks. And Amy, the gentle-spirited, uncomplaining, but soul-stricken Amy, where is she? Too soon vanished the delusive star upon which she had fixed her worshipping gaze. It fell. But her eyes were not less meekly nor less steadily turned to that firmament beyond which a holier star was shining. I mourn for the tender mother, and the fond old father, of whose lengthening days she is the sun. For as the autumn leaves blush when their glory must depart, so nature, in her feeble strife with death, has crimsoned Amy's cheek with a hectic hue that proclaims defeat. And in the fair girl's blue orbs there is a lustrous light that only illumines the eye when it takes its last farewell of earth. And Blanche, the two victims of heaven pardon him, they are withering side by side. Blanche has never recovered her reason, nor of the hand by which her vengeance was accomplished. I loved her tenderly, and would have gladly retained her with me, but to my entreaties Amy answered, "When I am gone, take my place, and be to her all that you have been. While I remain, I shall find a sad pleasure in watching over one so much more miserable than myself. You have many duties, mine are but too few." Of Colonel Damerow, I only know that he disappeared from the city soon after his accident. The papers for some time daily teemed with different accounts of the terrible injury he had received, but all mention and even remembrance of him has long since died away. Where he is hidden, his disfigured countenance seems no longer a matter of interest. Peace be with him, the peace of which he has robbed so many without enriching himself. Ah, Netta! Rosy, roguish, industrious little Netta! Ellen's shadow in her right arm. Netta springs up and thrives like a weed, but her blossoms are those of the unconscious wildflower, and it would not be difficult to recognize what hand had nourished the soil about this vigorous little daisy. And Netta's parents. Dan has not entirely recovered his sight, but Mr. Elton has found him plenty of work, which is almost as good, and he has never broken the temperance pledge. Nancy, well, if she does not always follow the good path, it is not because the way is not often enough pointed out to her. There is a certain gentle hand that stretches itself forth to lead her into the road as often as she swerves aside, and it is to be hoped that one of these days she will learn to walk straight ahead. And Billy, in this land of newspapers and cheap publications, newsboys form an important part of the population. Some who now carry literary bundles beneath their arms will ride in their carriages before they die, and I see no reason why Billy himself may not be nominated as a member of Congress one of these days. Rise, rise! It matters not from what obscure pit a man may spring. If he has the talent, the energy, the will, he may still rise. The highest summit which America boasts is not beyond the reach of its humblest born citizen. At present, Billy looks forward to no greater glory than that of becoming a smasher and the rival of Mark. Billy already expresses it as his opinion that he knows when a book's worth the crying, and whether it's going to take off like hot cakes or cold, as well as the biggest-fisted smasher of them all. I believe him. Success to Billy the newsboy. The sturdy little fellow now prides himself upon his honesty, thanks to Ellen, as much as on his boxing, and he is an honor to his profession. "Hurrah, hurrah for Billy!" cry his ragged young brethren, after he has been haranguing them during idle times at some street corner. And hurrah for Billy, say I. May the newsboys ever find him easy to meet, but hard to beat. And these are all in whose histories your interest has been awakened. Nay, there is one more. Laura Hilson. I cannot so well give you a portrait of her pent life as by repeating a conversation which took place between Ellen and myself this afternoon. She had come to pass a sociable hour with me, and we were sitting by the window idling over our needles and looking out into the broad avenue. As we chatted away, making our gossiping observations on the world at large, a splendid open barouche, with a liveried footman and coachman, and drawn by 2 white horses, whirled by us. The barouche contained a lady, magnificently attired, and though it fled with rapidity, we both recognized beneath the rich white Mechlin veil the blooming features of Laura Hilson. "What a superb equipage! Laura Hilson! Can it be possible? How came she there?" asked Ellen, all in one breath. "I forgot to tell you," was my answer, "that I heard the other day Miss Hilson was married." "Married to whom?" "To a southern planter of immense wealth, and a quite accomplished young man. I believe that his name is Ruthven, and he is said to have been a friend of Colonel Damereau. Mr. Ruthven was travelling for pleasure, and in passing through New York found the principal hotels full, and took room at Fleecer's. He saw Laura, and they are married. That is all I know on the subject." Ellen sat dejectedly musing for some time, and then, looking at me with a sorrowful expression, said, "Does it seem just in divine providence, who governs all things, that while the good are often bowed down by suffering and die, sometimes in misery, such misery as we have witnessed, that a being wicked as Laura Hilson should arrive at the summit of her wishes, should be loaded with riches, and be raised to a position which commands respect, if not adulation?" "Can you not then conceive, dear Ellen," I replied, "that those very riches, that adulation, may be the bitterest curses instead of blessings? Wealth and high station are blessings to those who prize them for the sake of ministering to others. They are blessings to those who look to some good use as the desirable end of riches. But what is opulence to such as regard self alone? Is it not a curse, since it makes them place their affections entirely upon worldly things from which they must be parted? If it seduces their minds, and alienates their hearts from the contemplation of elevated subjects, is it not a curse? If it excites in them an uncontrollable desire for personal gratification, is it not a curse? Do not they themselves feel it a curse when, loving it so devotedly, they remember that they cannot carry it away with them, and that the unconquerable tyrant death may separate them at any hour from their treasures?" "I admit the force of your argument," said Ellen, "and yet I would willingly believe that the wicked were punished on earth and the good rewarded. And by balancing our accounts here, you would rob hereafter of half its sustaining consolations. If we found our heaven in this world, we should hardly be willing to seek it in another, and— I see now the short-sightedness of my own wishes," cried Ellen, interrupting me. "I would not for the universe be deprived of the perfect willingness to die which I now feel. Hereafter, yes, we must live for the hereafter. It is the reference which our seeming blessings bear to our future state which should render them prized or valueless. True, very true." So ended our grave conversation, and with it ends this long letter, for which I am almost inclined to make the apologies of a schoolgirl, but forbear, when I remember your habitual leniency and the constitutional blindness to all that is defective. End of chapter 24. End of Evelyn, or A Heart Unmasked, a novel by Anna Cora Mowatt.